Welcome back everyone. October is the time for spooks. For spine-tingling ghosties and ghouls to run amok. But myself personally, while I know it's all in good fun, I just could never really get into the holiday myself. I tried to, certainly, but something never really clicked. So instead, we'll chase away the scares by telling a story that the monsters will be afraid of. A story of virtue, of knightly honor, of love, of romance, and a hint of tragedy as well, as we take a look at the story of the first son of Edward III, Edward of Woodstock, also known as the Black Prince. Now, the Black Prince was not a prince in a vacuum. He was very much moulded by the history that preceded him. So let's take a quick moment to look at the context around his more recent ancestry. Edward II was an objectively terrible king who routinely abdicated responsibility, lavished his favourites with abhorrent boons, accrued debt for the country, and held a tyrannical grip over the kingdom, eventually leading to multiple rebellions and a civil war. Edward's wife, Isabella, and her ally/eventual lover, Roger Mortimer, gathered allies in France before deposing the king at around the 31st of October 1326, officially abdicating his crown on the 24th of January 1327, with the throne passing to his then 14-year-old son, Edward III. As Edward was not yet of age, his mother and her lover oversaw the country of England as regents, faring no better than Edward II, with Roger in particular causing several stirs in debt accruing, including in Wales, and eventually possibly having the imprisoned Edward II assassinated. When Edward III came of age, he ousted his guardians, had his mother placed on house arrest with her political powers stripped, and Mortimer was tried and executed as a traitor.
I feel like the maid. I just cleaned up this mess. Can we keep it clean for 10 minutes?
Now, much like Edward I, Edward III was inspired by the Arthurian legends and sought to reclaim the honour of the Plantagenet name, routinely hosting tournaments which served not only as entertainment, but also served as training exercises for the Knights of the Realm. He first sought to quell the Scots before his sights turned to France, where under Henry II the crown had held multiple territories, but had subsequently been lost, mostly by King John.
Oh, King John, what a disaster!
This was the kingship that Edward of Woodstock was born into. Born the 15th of June 1330, Edward grew up surrounded by the chivalric majesty of a knightly court, parliament, and the magnificence worthy of Arthurian legend. So it really was no surprise that he took to the same standards of knighthood as his father, by the age of 7 having a full suit of armour, sword, and military tent, all of which he was expected to maintain himself. It was clear that since an early age, Edward III wanted his son to receive a full education in the art of warfare, attending his first tournament at 6 before taking part in his first at 13. In July 1338, Edward was present as those stationed at the Tower of London prepared for a French invasion, while Edward III was away. While he was away, the Black Prince had been named as Guardian of England, a lofty title that came with responsibilities, including the overseeing of taxes and trade. The prince was not actually in command of the defence, but witnessed the tactics and leadership required firsthand. During this period, Edward oversaw the war monopoly, a gambit cooked up by his father to secure funding for his campaign, as well as send tax funds to the king. When his father eventually returned from facing Philip VI of France on the 21st of February 1340, he was styling himself as both King of England and France. The 100 Years' War had officially begun. So I suppose everything changed when the English attacked. With the war came Edward's first battle. And anyone knows that the hero's journey comes with challenge. The chaotic or malicious dragon that the hero must fight against, rise up against that tyranny, and prove his mettle. And this battle would prove to be the Black Prince's first test. In 1346, Edward III's army marched through France. The now 16-year-old Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall was in command of the vanguard, while his father commanded the midguard, and the rearguard was presided over by the Bishop of Durham, Thomas Hatfield. Edward had been knighted as soon as he had stepped onto French soil, along with many others, including William Montague and Roger Mortimer III, hoping for redemption for his family's misdeeds. Along their march, the army had sacked and conquered towns and cities along the Seine, making for Paris, before diverting north for Flanders, planning to rendezvous with Flemish allies. By the time they had arrived there, however, they found their allies had departed the campaign, leaving them on their own for the following battle. The two armies of English and French met at Crecy on the 26th of August. The French, led by Philip VI, did not have as much equipment as the English, but they did have the numbers, with nearly double the number of men at around 25,000. This would, in earlier days, have been enough to win a battle such as this, but Edward was prepared, and had emphasized something new in his strategy: longbows. With an average of 5.5 arrows loosened per archer per minute, the sky rained arrows and quickly leveled the field, along with another new addition to the battlefield: cannons. Although primitive, they were still dangerous, booming and very new to the average French soldier. But even with all this, it was clear that the MVP of the battle was the Black Prince, cutting his way through his enemies and still issuing commands to his men in the thick of battle. His example was an inspiring one. A part of the battle which has passed into legend was a moment in the battle where things looked dire, and so the Black Prince called out to his father for assistance, only for his father to be said to say, "As long as my son is alive, they suffer him this day to win his spurs." Whether it's true or not, this line showcases Edward III's expectations for his son and heir. And in any case, the Black Prince met these expectations as the battle was won. This was followed by a siege of Calais, which lasted until October 1347, ending with Calais being seized by England, in a hold that lasted for 2 centuries. Despite how valiant or how battle-worn both father and son had been on the battlefield, there was something which neither of them could fight against and was far more powerful than any of them: plague. Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague swept through Europe, with between a third and half of England's population falling victim, including the 15-year-old Princess Jo, who was preparing to marry Peter of Castile. A tragic turn of events that shook the whole country, and proved that no one was immune to either the touch of disease or the inevitability of death. But Edward III was not going to let that stand in the way of his ambition. On St. George's Day, 23rd of April, 1349, Edward III arranged a tournament of the joust to take place at Windsor Castle. The 25 knights invited to the tournament, including the Black Prince, were all veterans of the French wars, and all had an integral part to play. Edward had more planned than just a tournament, having styled both himself and his court on Arthurian legend. It had come time for his own round table, having a house built onto Windsor Castle and dedicated to St. George, where said round table would be kept. This cohort of 24 knights, along with father and son, would become England's Grand Order of Knights, the Order of the Garter. Garters are an odd symbol for a knightly order, admittedly. It was in that transitionary period between being a male effect symbolizing nobility and becoming a feminine item with sexual undertones in the 15th century, with it being likely that Edward was referencing the younger days of being a youthful knight, and the virtues of knighthood he wanted to pass to the next generation. Much like the tournaments, the order had another reason to exist. Edward III was well aware of the history of his ancestors, and knew too well how many times plans for battles and defences of territory were dragged or stopped by knights and earls who had seen no function in putting time, resources, and potentially their lives into a matter of little personal profit. The order changed that, making the march to battle not an obligation or a chore, but a cultural honour, a high responsibility that showcased the greatest virtues of knighthood. It was a crucial step in his ambitions to rebuild the Plantagenet Empire. Meanwhile, the Black Prince had set himself up nicely. He was a war hero, a proven leader, heir to the throne, and most of all, a generous giver of gifts, spending lavishly on his friends and key figures around him, having a standing stock of cash ready for the battle camp, to gamble with his fellows as a form of building respect and camaraderie, all of which worked for a time. But there were other forces at work, and not just the plague, which was still ravaging Europe. On the 24th of November, 1349, Edward received word that France was about to make a bid to retake Calais. Without a moment to lose, and not enough time to raise a full army, Edward set out with a small company of knights, including the Black Prince, who arrived by January 1350 to defend the town. They managed to bottleneck the invading French knights at the town gate. Within hours, they had maintained security of their territory, and ascribed another legend of bravery for king and prince. Following this, in August, Philip VI passed, being succeeded by John II. The vicious tug-of-war for control of territory continued until eventually eventually it came down to the Battle of Poitiers in the 19th of September 1356 between John II's French army and the Black Prince's English and Gascon soldiers. The Prince's army were a well-oiled machine, organised and trained, and although the French outnumbered them by double the men, it was clear that the English were better disciplined and more ready compared to the bullish and fractured French. The battle was a bloodbath, with many French knights, noblemen and counts being either killed or captured, the latter including John II himself. This was the crowning achievement of the Black Prince, already being informally referred to by his closest as Edward IV. John II's ransom was higher than any king in recorded history, higher than Richard the Lionheart's before them. With much deliberation and compromise, it was eventually lowered, along with Edward III letting go of his claim to France, so long as he was given the territories of Aquitaine, Poitiers, Saint-Onage, and Angoulême. To celebrate and to give his son greater honours, Edward III gifted the Black Prince the Principality of Aquitaine, a high honour. But for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. A second wave of the Black Death came to Europe, striking once more at the royal family, killing both Mary, Countess of Brittany, and Margaret, Countess of Pembroke, along with the passing of Henry of Grosmont, a respected warrior that the prince held in deepest regard. But after this came rejoice, for every prince needs a princess. Joan of Kent was raised in the royal household, alongside Edward of Woodstock and his older sisters. She eventually married the future Earl of Salisbury in January 1341, making regular appearances at the royal court, and being considered the most beautiful woman of the age. But some trouble came her way when Sir Thomas Holland, no, not that one, in October 1347, claimed that her marriage was invalid, as the two had secretly married 8 months before her marriage to Salisbury, including the consummation. The whole ordeal had to eventually be appealed to the Pope, as Holland had no credible witnesses. There were no priests to give credibility to the union, and the fact that Joan was 12 at this supposed time all made his account spotty to say the least. It is in fact more likely that Joan and Holland began an affair far more recently, with the two concocting the marital scandal in order to get Salisbury out of the way. By 1349, the marriage between her and Salisbury was officially voided, and her marriage to Holland was sanctified in a proper ceremony. Holland died during the second outbreak, leaving behind 5 children and a 32-year-old widow. But not to worry, as between the now Prince of Aquitaine and the Countess, a spark began to grow. And by the summer of 1361, it was announced that the Black Prince would marry Joan of Kent. This was an out-of-left-field move. Typically, someone of Edward's station would marry a fellow royal of another country, as had been done before to aid in alliances. But instead, the Arthurian-inspired romantic prince married for love. Now, Joan was someone of royal blood, technically being the cousin to the king and second cousin to Edward of Woodstock. And even though everyone agreed her to be the loveliest lady of the kingdom, there was still plenty of hoops to jump through before they could officially tie the knot. And it courted its own breed of controversy, but as time would show, Joan of Kent would be an integral part of the royal family. August 1366 brought a meeting between the Black Prince and the disgraced former king of Castile, Pedro the Cruel. He had been ousted from the throne by his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, due to his tyrannical rule and malicious ideas of leadership. Pedro wanted to secure alliance with England to retake the throne, and Edward III, seeing an opportunity to bolster his alliances and his naval force, agreed. It was understood that Pedro would employ the services of England and Aquitaine's armies, and pay once he had retaken the throne of Castile, a debt he could only pay if he did retake the throne and the fortune that came with it. This was a plan where the Black Prince had the most to lose. The bulk of the force would come from Gascony and the prince's own retinue, as well as knights and lords stationed in Aquitaine, with many initial costs coming out of the prince's own pocket, with the assurance that he would recoup later. The prince himself foolishly jumped to aid Pedro in his reclamation. Not just out of chivalric duty, but out of hubris, thinking that this campaign would cement his military legacy. But if he thought this campaign would further his honours, the prince soon realised how mistaken he was. Pedro only grew more and more sadistic and brutal in his methods, ordering all around him to be destroyed and everyone murdered. Not just the men, but the women and the children too. He torched villages, defiled churches, allegedly murdered his wife. It was clear that this man was an enemy of God's word, and the pious prince suddenly saw his mistake in aiding such a man. The prince considered rescinding his aid, until eventually he and Pedro agreed that he would only give support to the banished king if he swore to dedicate himself and his kingship to religious piety and good moral action. There was little word that Pedro would keep his word, but the prince had to try. It all came down to the Battle of Najera, which was easily won by the English against the disorganized forces. Pedro was placed back on the throne, but unfortunately he then refused to pay back his debts to the Black Prince. Whether because he didn't have the funds, or because he never actually sought to pay the prince back. The cost for the Prince of Aquitaine was high in many ways. In the subsequent years he was forced to levy high taxations to make up the costs to his Gascon allies. But on the personal level, the summer heat during the campaign led to an outbreak of dysentery that struck at least a third of the English forces, and the prince himself contracted illness, either malaria or dropsy. As Edward battled both his illness and bankruptcy, the lordship of Aquitaine refused to handle such poor management, and by 1368 went to Charles V of France to once again take up arms against England and take back Aquitaine, a position Charles was more than willing to take after England replanted Pedro, who had broken a treaty with France. By 1369, French forces had surrounded Aquitaine, and then Pedro the Cruel was murdered by Henry of Trastamara and supplanted, capping off how much of a waste the Castilian campaign had been. Both Henry and Charles united against the prince, and by 1371 he had returned to England a shadow of his former self, ravaged by illness and bankruptcy. As his illness progressed, he sought more and more religious piety, hoping that if he repented for backing the evil at heart Pedro, he would be absolved of his frailty. He read religious texts, devoted himself to prayer, ate a restricted diet, and all the time grew only worse. His temper and mood darkened, as did his appearance become fewer and fewer, notably becoming more brutal in his illness, with less patience for his remaining campaigns. But before the disease ravaged him completely, there was still one last piece of familial business to deal with. While Edward III's Queen Philippa had passed in 1369, before and since her death, the king had been entertained by his mistress, Alice Perez, the Morgana of this Arthurian tale, who in the intervening years managed to worm her way into becoming a powerful member of the aging king's court, using the king to flaunt extravagant wealth and to claim political power to suit her comfort and interest. Eventually, she and other magnates who had leeched off of the old king were trialed and had lands and powers confiscated, with Perez in particular being accused of witchcraft, likely by the Black Prince, and seducing the king with magical trickery. This would be the last act of Edward of Woodstock. He organised his burial in Canterbury Cathedral before passing in June 1376 on St. Trinity's Day. Where once there had been a strong and decisive leader, a powerful warrior, and a future king, now there was only a dim flame. In the following centuries would rise the moniker of the Black Prince, a nod to his darker mood in his later years. And unfortunately, his chivalric nature would not live on in his son, Richard II, who sadly took more after Edward II in terms of kingship. But instead, we can take heart in the qualities that Edward displayed before his dark days. Charity, bravery, love, respect, religious piety. Perhaps there is something in such a story that we can emulate, and that we can learn from. Such a thing is in our hands. But until next time, thank you all for watching, and until next time, peace be with you.